Oi oi, alright, how's it going? I'm Grant, you're you. This is DoodleReview. A couple months back I put out a video on what I consider the hidden Queens of the Stone Age albums. A collection of records that featured such significant contributions from the Queen's members that they took on a lot of the band's characteristics and serve as a nice kind of parallel catalogue to complement the band's official discography. I made a point to include mostly the non-obvious albums, so if you're sitting there rolling your eyes being like, oh, video on Desert Sessions or whatever, go check it out. You might be surprised. It's linked below. People seem to like it, so I thought I'd hit you with part 2, another collection of projects to check out that might scratch that itch if you're looking for a Queensy sound. 2 disclaimers though before we get into it. Number 1, the albums mentioned in part 1 of this series to me are my definitive hidden Queens records. As we expand into part 2 and beyond, I just want to acknowledge kind of up front that we are starting to now dilute things a little. The Queen sound is less present, but I still think you'll get a kick out of these. Number 2, I'm a lover, not an expert, alright? So if you hear me say anything that's not quite right, just let me know in the comments. I'm always happy to be corrected, and I'm interested to learn more. And on that note, if you also have any extra bits of trivia to chip in, by all means please do. Alright, let's get into it though. The first record we're going to start with is Millionaire Paradisiac. Millionaire are a Belgian alternative rock act led by Tim Van Hamel and featuring Dave Schroyen, Bas Remens and Aldo Struijff, among others. They first became introduced into the extended Queens of the Stone Age family when they toured with Masters of Reality in the early 2000s, during which time the band really impressed Josh Homme, who then invited them to open for Queens on their tour. Relationships were formed during this time, and Van Hamel was invited to become one of the very first Eagles of Death Metal, joining Homme and Jesse Hughes by playing some guitar and bass on the first record, and I think touring as the band's bassist in the very early days. Eventually, when it came time for Van Hamel and his bandmates to record the second Millionaire album, they invited Josh Homme and Alan Johannes to record and produce, resulting in Paradisiac. This album actually got a little criticised at the time for breaking too far from the sound of the band's first, but I think it's great. It actually has quite a loose, scratchy, kind of wild sound that is less Queens and more akin to the underground bands of the early 2000s like At the Drive-In or the Icarus Line, but there is definitely a core kind of riffy grooviness that could be cousins with our favourite Palm Desert band, and I think fans will get a kick out of the album, particularly songs like A Lust Unmatched and We Don't Live There Anymore. While Paradisiac has the most direct link to Queens due to the Homme Johannes production, I definitely recommend checking out the first album Outside the Simian Flock, particularly the song Petty Thug, which is an absolute banger. Such a banger, in fact, that during Queen's making of the Queen's 4th album Lullabies to Paralyze, they had it written on their kind of board of songs, meaning Homme and co either recorded a cover we're yet to hear or they at the very least plan to. If you like Millionaire, it's definitely worth diving into the huge wealth of great Belgian alternative rock there is out there. A commenter on my last prior video rightly pointed out how many links there are back to Queens through great musicians like Aldo Struijff, who collaborated deeply with Mark Lanegan over the years. There's a lot of great stuff to be discovered going down this tangent, and I look forward to hopefully talking about this more over time and coming back to it in a future video. The second album I want to talk about is the short-lived Brody Dalle project Spinnerette. Released in 2009, this was the first musical endeavour from Dalle since the breakup of her breakthrough punk band, The Distillers, around 2005. If I remember rightly, the album wasn't too highly regarded by the core kind of punk side of Dalle's fan base, who obviously fell in love with the ragged punk anthems of her prior band and were less interested in an album that placed a bigger focus on groove, riff, hooks and a fair amount of experimentation. As a fan of all of those things though, and a huge fan of Brody Dalle's songwriting and amazing voice, Coral Fang is one of the best punk albums of the 2000s, if not the best, and her voice is one of my favourites in all of rock music. I think the Spinnerette album is seriously overlooked and well worth your time. The reason for the Queens of the Stone adjacent sound is the production and performances from the powerhouse that is Alan Johannes, a frequent collaborator with the Queen's camp and of course one-time member in the 2005-2006 Lullabies era. Johannes produced and played guitar, bass and piano among other instruments alongside Dahl's guitars, bass, keyboards and vocals, Jack Irons on drum and Tony Bevilacqua on guitars. Alan Johannes' influence on the Queen's overall sound, and the sound that sometimes gets solely ascribed to Homme, can't actually be overstated. Between 2001, initially kind of working on those Rated R bonus tracks, and then Desert Sessions 7 and 8, all the way up through them Crooked Vultures, you will find Johannes and his much missed, sadly departed writing partner Natasha Schneider's fingerprints across many of the Queen's related releases. Sometimes I think the reason Johannes gets a little overlooked is because his guitar style complements Homme so well that they can be kind of difficult to distinguish. And it's actually quite fascinating because both artists have a very unique approach to their instrument, and it's kind of like they've taken two paths to kind of get to the same overall spot. Homme's playing style comes from a combination of learning polka first and foremost, and then on top of that kind of modifying scales by subtracting notes and reversing sequences. This leads to his trademark kind of drunken stumble kind of sound. Johannes is actually more of a virtuoso than Homme, to be honest. He can seemingly play any instrument to a classically trained expert level, but the style he operates in is kind of, it has this very unique groove. It's equal parts blues and equal parts Romani-esque Django Reinhardt. I'm really stretching my knowledge of music to describe this here, but it's not because it's because I've just not found any examples of Johannes really explaining his style. So I'm just kind of giving you my best approximation of what it sounds like to my ears. Anyway, I think that despite taking two different approaches, that Homme and Johannes end up in a very kind of similar place tonally, and that, coupled with clearly the same shared taste for groove-based, almost kind of sleazy rock, makes them a perfect partnership. And I know that's a detour, but I think it's valid because not only will you find Johannes' involvement across many of these releases, but in the case of Spinnerette, so much of the criticism Dahl received for the sound of this project came from people assuming Homme's involvement due to their being married at the time, and it just wasn't true. But for all the reasons I just shared, I could kind of see why. Back to the album though, Spinnerette to me has some of the most amazing vocals from Dahl. She delivers lip-biting sultry sexiness on tracks like Ghetto Love, soaring hooks on All Babes Are Wolves and Driving Song, and really sweet gliding ethereal kind of vocals on Distorting a Code. It's an album that allows the singer and songwriter to really stretch artistically after working in the punk space for so long, and while that naturally maybe alienated fans at the time, I think it really pays off. The album jumps from sleazy rock riffs to electronic sad disco to whatever the hell Impaler is, and it's rad. The project ended up being a one-off, with Dahl's next venture being a straight-up solo record under her own name called Diploid Love. This one also featured Johannes as producer and some great guest stars and songs, but moved, I think, in a slightly more straightforward rock direction as opposed to the grimy, deep, dark midnight experimentation of Spinnerette. Get into it, I think it just gets better with age. Let's next talk scores and soundtracks, the first of which In the Fade, a German movie by director Fatih Akin starring Diane Kruger, a neo-Nazi revenge drama. According to director Akin, he felt the two general themes of the film were melancholia and aggression, and when toying with that in his mind, the band that would come up the most were Queens of the Stone Age. As a result, he built a playlist that he felt would represent the state of mind of Kruger's character and what she would listen to. When he handed this to the music supervisor on the movie and they noted like 10 Queen's tracks were on it, they suggested that Akin just reach out to Homme and see if he was up for scoring the movie, and he was, under the proviso that he basically be able to watch the movie and kind of create whatever he felt. The resulting collection of music is quite unique. It's the first time we've really had a musical score from Homme. He's contributed to songs to many soundtracks, as we're about to cover, but rarely have we had instances of him composing instrumentals to support more of a visual narrative. The finished product, I think, is quite interesting in that it really feels authentic to this movie. You wouldn't listen to this and think, ah, yeah, this is like definitely a Homme joint. In fact, as someone that is a big Nine Inch Nails fan and as a result listens to a lot of Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross scores, it's not a million miles away from the sort of dark, ominous and dissonant tones that they would conjure for a movie. The score was performed by Homme, Troy Van Leeuwen and Mikey Shoes, and it was recorded somewhere around the time that they were mixing Villains in 2017. According to Homme, he felt that so much of the movie's narrative is from Diane Kruger's internal perspective, that the music should reflect that. As such, he wrote music according to kind of biorhythms and things that represent stress. The song End Credits to me is the closest to anything you might eventually find on a Queen's album. It actually uses a sonogram of a heartbeat and builds around this. The piece scratches on the door of an ominous Queen's tune like Sicily, but as it's a score, it never quite goes over the line. This isn't one I go back to a ton, but I recommend giving it a look purely for its very unique kind of position within the Queen's canon. Actually, while I say Homme hasn't done a great deal of score work, there is one exception I'd want to note, and that is his musical contribution to the Anthony Bourdain show No Reservations. In Series 7, Episode 13, Bourdain chose the Californian desert as the focal point for this stop on his travels, and naturally got his good mate Homme to take him to the best spots. Lots of Queen's tunes are featured in the episode, which is a banger, and as well as featuring Bourdain, he asked Homme to write and record some of the score for the external shots and transitional sequences of the episode. The result is a kind of expansive, meditative surf rock piece that, while you can't kind of download it anywhere, it is on YouTube and worth looking up. Just search Josh Homme Desert Roll and a kind YouTuber has uploaded it. Of course, we can't talk about Anthony Bourdain without mentioning his travelogue series Parts Unknown, for which Homme wrote the theme song and sang alongside Mark Lanegan. It's kind of bittersweet knowing that Bourdain and Lanegan are both no longer with us, but the theme song never fails to kind of raise a smile from me when I watch an episode. Bourdain stated that the brief he gave to Homme was that he wanted something kind of optimistic but with a darkness to it, and I think the pairing of him and Lanegan really nails that. Again, this isn't available to buy or stream standalone, but you can find it on YouTube, or better yet, just watch Parts Unknown and luxuriate in just one of the coolest travel and food shows that there ever was. Bringing a close to this Bourdain trilogy, we also have to mention the documentary on the life of Anthony Bourdain called Roadrunner, as once again there is a soundtrack contribution from Homme. This time in the form of an end credits song called Black and Blue is the best I can do. It's a punchy, kind of simple, straightforward rock song. When it came out in 2021, it was the first piece of Queen's music we'd heard since 2017's Villains, so it obviously set fans ablaze as to what they could expect next from the band. Some good, some bad. As it turns out, In Times New Roman was, I think, a much deeper, more complex record, but this is no less of a fun tune with an extra resonance, knowing it was likely written with Homme ruminating on Bourdain's tortured soul and possibly his own demons. Again, this is not officially available yet, but you'll find a YouTube version which has pulled the track from the end credits of the movie. While we're talking end credits, we should also mention the song Nobody to Love, included at the end of the David Ayer directed 2012 movie End of Watch, starring Jake Gyllenhaal and Michael Pena. This is a low-key rocker written by Josh Homme and produced and recorded, most interestingly, by David Sardi, a guy that has worked with a ton of people and also led his own band Bark Market. Much more about them to come in the future because I love them. This track came out a little before Queen's Like Clockwork album, and to me definitely sounds like something written in that period, kind of thematically and lyrically. I think it feels at home with like The Vampire of Time and Memory and the song Like Clockwork, even sharing a bit of a kind of sparser arrangement, although ultimately Nobody to Love delivers some harder guitars than those examples. This one again is a little tough to pin down on streaming, but YouTube is your friend. One of the earliest original soundtrack contributions for the Queens was the movie The Dangerous Life of Altar Boys. While the majority of the score was handled by experienced composer Marco Beltrami, the plot of the movie revolved around high school kids who write their own kind of pulpy comic book. And for those sequences, the director wanted a unique sound and so the producer Bob Stevenson, who directed the Monsters in the Parasol video, suggested reaching out to the band. This was around 2001 when Queens were preparing Songs for the Deaf, and so the band were in a writing mode. According to interviews with Homme and Nick Oliveri, it took them no longer than 35 minutes to kind of demo the 4 or 5 tracks for the film, because they were in that kind of zone. The finished tracks that appear on the soundtrack were rounded out most interestingly with Brad Wilk from Rage Against the Machine on drums, perhaps because they always wanted to collaborate, or it might be because this occurred in the kind of period between Rated R era drummer Gene Troutman leaving and Def era drummer Dave Grohl joining. Who knows? It's pretty cool that it happened though. The tracks are mostly instrumental, and a lot of them, like Stoned or the Atomic Trinity, really capture the style of the band in the pre-Def 1999 to 2001 era, which was quite a garage rock sort of vibe. The big standout is the one vocal track called All the Same, and this is an absolute gem in the Queen's canon and rarely talked about because of the inclusion on this quite obscure soundtrack. It's a perfect example of an early 2000s melancholic, mellow but gritty banger. It might be one of the most accessible tunes the band ever put their name to. As usual, this stuff is hard to come by on streaming, but out there on YouTube. So we definitely can't talk about soundtracks, particularly from this period, without mentioning Heavy Metal 2000. This was a sequel to the animated movie Heavy Metal that was released in the 1980s, inspired by the fantasy genre, stuff like Dune, and of course a huge dose of comic book lore. The Frank Frazetta-esque imagery of the original movie garnered a bit of a cult following, particularly among teenagers. See the South Park episode Major Bubich. And heading into the new millennium, a sequel was launched. The creators wanted to do right by the heavy metal title for the soundtrack, and so assembled a pretty massive list of artists who mostly all contributed original or unreleased tunes. The album had at the time well-known artists like Pantera, Billy Idol and Bauhaus, but also then up-and-coming bands like Machine Head, System of a Down, and of course Queens of the Stone Age. Queens delivered what could be one of my all-time favourite tracks from the band, a hypnotic, psychedelic cut called Infinity. It's a song they'd been playing a lot on the road between 98 and 2000, and would occasionally, they'd occasionally treat fans to it from time to time over subsequent years. They even re-recorded the track for Lullabies to Paralyze, including it as a bonus track on the Japanese and vinyl editions of the album in 2005. This one is well worth hunting down. The 2005 version I think might be up on streaming depending on your region, but I definitely recommend looking up the 2000 version included on the Heavy Metal soundtrack for sure. From the desert of a faraway planet to the Old West, the gamers among you will probably be familiar with this one, Cruel World from the Red Dead Redemption 2 soundtrack. This is a song written and recorded and produced by Daniel Lanois, but was passed to Josh Homme to add the final lead vocals. Interestingly, when it looked like first choice Willie Nelson wasn't going to contribute due to a hurricane that prevented him from getting to the studio. So Lanois reached out to Homme, who was touring Australia at the time, who put down the vocal tracks in a local studio. At the same time, apparently Willie Nelson did manage to get into the studio and then record his version. But because Lanois and the music team behind Red Dead were so pleased with Homme's take, they decided to include both versions. I've not got round to playing Red Dead, and by all accounts that's a big L on my part because it's supposed to be amazing, but as I understand it, the versions of the song are triggered in the game at different points in the story to quite a kind of gratifying emotional payoff. This one you can find on streaming and is a traditional country song offering a side of Homme we'd rarely kind of seen up until this point. Definitely check it out. In a parallel universe, this wasn't the first time Homme or the Queens contributed to the soundtrack of a Rockstar produced video game. Slight detour into speculation here, but I remember around 2005-2006 there was a pretty strong rumour that Queens had recorded a cover of Joe Walsh's In the City for inclusion in Rockstar's game adaptation of the classic movie Warriors. This was actually reported by some publications at the time, so it's not completely baseless, but by the time the game came out there was no Queens music to be found, so who knows what happened with that. Anyone in the comments want to clear that up, that'd be sweet. Although there isn't a Queen's version to hear, do give a listen to the original. It would have been so cool to hear a homie take on that track for sure. Okay, sticking on the gaming topic for a bit, let's talk Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon series, namely the Wildlands entry. Why? Well, because none other than Alan Johannes wrote the score, and among the performers were fellow Queen's alumni Joey Castillo and Nick Oliveri. This is an album available on streaming that clocks in at a full 1 hour and 41 minutes, full of atmospheric, full band soundscapes that even if you haven't played the game and don't know anything about it, you'd listen to, and it would transport you into a dense or tense desert dangerous soundscape. There is a behind the scenes interview with Johannes which gives a great insight into how the makers of the game approach the soundtrack, and it's really cool how much care and attention to detail there is here. They gathered inspiration for the music in two ways. Firstly, the makers took a trip to Bolivia to try and understand the culture a little more, and were struck by how many people kind of play instruments and the great mixture of those instruments. And secondly, they installed kind of big screens at Johannes's home where his studio is, and the musicians kind of just then improvised off the visuals from the game. It's really cool, and it's a great score. Ubisoft even came back to Johannes for more great soundtrack work on the next Ghost Recon game, this one called Breakpoint. This one is a bit heavier and grittier, and for fans of Nine Inch Nails there's also a crossover here with Alessandro Cortini providing the electronics. This one also worth checking out. Okay, so from one Queen's bassist to another, next let's talk some of Mikey Shu's soundtrack work. I appreciate we're now quite way off the beaten path, but if we're talking sound scores and soundtracks, we've got to be thorough. Current and now longest serving Queen's bassman Mikey Shu's in 2017 released a score for the movie Feed, and for fans of Schumann's extracurricular band Mini Mansions, this should definitely go on your list to check out. Feed was directed by Tommy Bertelsen and produced by Troyan Belisario, both friends of Schumann, who contacted the bassist and multi-instrumentalist because they were looking for a big soundtrack with songs that felt recognizable even though they didn't have the budget to license well-known tracks. This brief of having to score some of the emotional beats of the movie but also write and deliver some really fun, timeless sounding pop songs leads to an album that's actually quite enjoyable on its own terms, and once again proves the talents of Queen's low-end warrior. Cigarettes and No Regrets showcases the songwriter's impressively high falsetto and combines this with a forlorn whistle to create a really melancholic track. Off to the Races gives us a frantic looping bass line that just tugs on the sleeves of later Queen's tracks like Haunted House and What the Peephole Say, while Have You Seen Her delivers some fantastic Elliott Smith vibes. This, though, was far from Mikey's first foray into Hollywood. He was also in Adam Sandler's The Wedding Singer. Just thought I'd chuck that in as a fun fact. Sticking with the bass player with the Perpetual Birthday for a little longer, let's talk about this hidden gem, Emily Wolf's Outlier album. Wolf is a singer-songwriter based in Austin, Texas, who has as much love for a riff as she does a pop hook. She's mentioned multiple times in the past the sound that she's been seeking is a combination of like pop megastar like Demi Lovato and Queens of the Stone Age. As such, when it came time to sit down to her third album, she actually enlisted Mikey Shu's as the producer. As a result, this album is a must listen for fans of Queen's, Schumann's, but more specifically Mini Mansions. Outlier utilizes a lot of synths and embeds hooks to such an extent it really reminds me of that band's Guy Walks Into a Bar record. Shu's produces, co-writes, plays bass and keys on the record, but I don't want to take anything away from Wolf's talent here either. Her tightly wound guitar weaved around the analog synths makes for a great sound. The songs themselves are awesome with great lyrics and strong vocals throughout. This sits in the singer-songwriter realm, but it's the attitude that sets it apart as much as the instrumentation. There's a kind of spit in your eye defiance under the surface of songs like No Man, LANY and Death Row Kiss that really stand out and make for some seriously sticky tracks. Okay, so let's end this video with one last album from another badass female singer-songwriter, and that's Nikki Lane with her 2022 album Denim and Diamonds. I first heard a country singer named Nikki Lane via her collaboration with Lana Del Rey on her Country Club record from 2021. It was then shortly after that I heard that none other than Josh Homme would be fully producing Lane's next album. And at first it felt like a kind of unusual job for Homme, right? Producing a country album. But then if you connect the dots retrospectively, you know, the sporadic solo acoustic shows in which he might cover a Johnny Cash tune, jumping on stage with Florence and the Machine to do a cover of Jackson, the occasional country needle drops on his Alligator Hour radio show, plus of course Cruel World, which we've just talked about. Actually, it seems like there's maybe a definite kind of country music lover under the layers of rock and roll grime even, and this album is another extension of that, perhaps preempting a future move in that world. We don't yet, you know. It's unclear how Homme and Lane initially crossed paths. From my reading around the topic, it may simply have been a well-placed phone call from Lane's management asking straight up if the Queen's frontman would be up for it. However it came to be though, it turns out to be a great combination. Over the 30-minute runtime of Denim and Diamonds, Lane strikes a perfect balance between reflective storytelling with songs like Faded and Pass It Down, and Light Hubris, the title track, and Born Tough for instance. While Homme's input will certainly be noticeable to fans, it's pretty subtle, mostly. The song Denim and Diamonds definitely kind of carries a lightweight but nonetheless recognisable Queen's riff, but even then, this never kind of overshadows the purity of Lane's songwriting, which I believe will strike a chord with most listeners, even if you're like me, generally a bit iffy on country music. Even if you're still not convinced by a country album, it's worth checking out for the all-star cast of Queen's extended family. Among them, Auto Lux's Carla Azar and Arctic Monkeys' Matt Helders on drums, Alan Johannes on a bit of everything, Mikey Shoes, Matt Sweeney, and of course Homme on guitar and a bit of backing vocals. This is a really fun one and brings us to the end of this selection of hidden extended Queens of the Stone Age family albums. Before I fully knock it on the head though, and you get down in the comments and tell me if you've loved or hated this video. If Queen's content is what you're craving, I've got a bunch of it. The first part of this series, of course, but then also a ranking of the various side projects, 5 key Mark Lanegan albums, and interviews with Joe Cardamone of the Icarus line and Travis Keller of Buddyhead, both artists from the LA scene who've crossed more than a few paths with Homme and co in one way or the other. Check them out and subscribe for more stuff to come. Cheers mate, bye.